The gates of Blackthorn Palace shook under the force of fists and claws. Smoke rose from the eastern wall, where a fire had been set only minutes before, and the sound of snarling filled the courtyard as guards rushed to hold the line against a pack of rebels who had come in the dead of night to test the strength of the new king. Ronan Blackthorn stood at the top of the stone steps, his eyes glowing gold, his shoulders squared, watching his men fight to protect the home he had inherited only 6 months earlier. He did not move to hide. He did not call for extra guards to shield him. He simply waited, arms crossed, until the last of the attackers had been driven back through the broken gate and into the dark forest beyond. When the courtyard finally fell silent, Ronan walked down the steps slowly, his boots echoing against the stone. The guards straightened as he passed, some of them bleeding, all of them exhausted. He did not thank them. He did not ask if they were hurt. He only asked one question, his voice low and cold enough to make the air feel colder. Who let them reach the wall? No one answered right away. Then a young guard named Finn stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. The gate watch was short. 2 men tonight, my king. I was told they were reassigned. Ronan's jaw tightened. Reassigned by whom? Finn hesitated, and in that hesitation, everyone in the courtyard understood that whatever answer came next would decide someone's fate. By the head of the household staff, my king. She said the men were needed to help move supplies for tomorrow's council meeting. It took less than a heartbeat for Ronan's anger to find its target. He did not wait to hear more, did not ask if there had been a miscommunication, did not consider that a woman moving supplies for a council meeting had no way of knowing that danger was coming that same night. He turned on his heel and stormed into the palace, his fury rolling off him like heat from a flame, and every servant in his path pressed themselves against the walls to let him pass. He found her in the kitchen corridor, a woman named Della, older than most of the staff, with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight knot. She had served the Blackthorn family for over 20 years, since before Ronan was even old enough to shift on his own. She was carrying a stack of folded linens when the king appeared before her, and the moment she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. "You pulled guards from the east gate," Ronan said, his voice sharp enough to cut, "tonight, while rebels were planning to breach these walls." Della's eyes widened. "My king, I did not know." "You didn't need to know," Ronan snapped. "You needed to leave the security of this palace to the men trained for it. Instead, 3 of my guards were injured tonight, because you decided your linen closet mattered more than the safety of this house. My king, please, I only did what I was told to do by the steward. I did not choose. I don't want excuses." His voice rose, filling the narrow corridor, and Della flinched back against the wall, the linens slipping from her arms and falling in a soft pile at her feet. "You are relieved of your position, effective now. Pack your things and leave the grounds by morning." The words landed like a blow. Della's mouth opened, then closed. 20 years of service, gone in the space of a single furious sentence. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that no one argued with the Alpha King, not even when he was wrong, and especially not when his eyes still burned gold with the heat of battle. Ronan turned and walked away without looking back, leaving her standing alone in the corridor among the scattered linens. What he did not see, because he never bothered to look, was the young woman standing at the far end of the hallway, half hidden behind a stone pillar, who had witnessed the entire exchange with growing disbelief. Her name was Elira Hart, and she had arrived at the palace only 3 days earlier to assist the royal healer. She had heard the stories about the king before she ever set foot inside these walls. Everyone had heard them. He was fair in battle, ruthless with enemies, and utterly without mercy for anyone who failed him, even in the smallest way. She had assumed, as most people did, that such stories were exaggerated the way stories about powerful men always are. Watching him now, she understood that they were not exaggerated at all. If anything, they were kind. She waited until Ronan's footsteps had faded down the hall before she moved from her hiding place and crossed to where Della still stood, frozen, staring at the fallen linens, as if she could not quite believe what had just happened. "Let me help you," Elira said softly, kneeling to gather the scattered fabric. Della looked at her, eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You shouldn't be seen helping me," Not now. Not after that. I don't care who sees me, Illyra said, and she meant it. She had spent her whole life being told to keep her head down, to avoid drawing attention, to let more powerful people have their way without comment. She had never been particularly good at following that advice, and she saw no reason to start tonight. She helped Della carry the linens to a side room, and once they were alone, she asked the older woman to tell her exactly what had happened. Della explained, her voice trembling, that the steward had ordered the reassignment of guards earlier that evening, hours before any sign of trouble, to help prepare the hall for the council meeting. She had simply passed the order along as she was told to do. She had no authority over guard placement. She had no way of knowing an attack was coming. The blame, if there was blame to assign, belonged somewhere else entirely. Does the king know this? Illyra asked. Della shook her head. He didn't ask. He never asks. He decides. And that is the end of it. Illyra felt something hot and sharp twist inside her chest, a feeling very close to anger, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. She had not come to this palace to challenge kings. She had come because the royal healer, an old woman named Margaret, had trained her since childhood and had recently requested help managing the palace infirmary. Illyra had accepted the position because it was steady work, because Margaret had been kind to her when few others had, and because a healer's life, whatever its difficulties, rarely put her in direct conflict with the people in power. And yet here she was, on only her third day, already furious at the man who ruled over all of it. She did not sleep well that night. She kept thinking about Della's face, about the sound of linens hitting the floor, about the casual cruelty of a king who could not be bothered to ask a single question before destroying someone's life. She told herself it was not her place to interfere, that she was new here, that she had no standing to challenge anything the Alpha King decided. She told herself this several times, and each time, the anger did not lessen even slightly. The following morning, she was called to the training yard behind the palace, where several guards had gathered to tend to injuries from the previous night's fight. Margaret was occupied with a more serious case inside the infirmary, so the task of checking the minor wounds fell to Illyra. She moved from guard to guard, cleaning cuts, wrapping bandages, offering quiet words of comfort. And it was there, in the middle of this ordinary work, that she first came face to face with the king himself. He arrived without warning, walking into the training yard still dressed for combat, a shallow gash across his forearm from the night's fighting, blood dried along the edge of the wound. He did not ask for help. He simply stood near the edge of the yard, arms crossed, watching his guards train as if his own injury did not exist. One of the older guards, a broad-shouldered man named Garrick who served as captain of the palace guard, noticed the wound and called out, "My king, you should have that looked at." "It's nothing," Ronan said, his tone final. Garrick, who had clearly worked under this particular stubbornness for years, simply gestured toward Illyra. "The healer's assistant is right here. It will take a moment." Ronan's gaze shifted, and for the first time, his eyes landed on Illyra. She felt the weight of that gaze immediately, a physical thing, heavy and assessing, the kind of look that made most people lower their eyes and step back. She did not lower her eyes. She had already decided, somewhere between last night and this morning, that she was not going to pretend respect for a man who had shown none to someone who deserved better. "It's not nothing," she said, nodding toward his arm. "It's already starting to swell at the edges. If you leave it, it will get worse before it gets better." A flicker of surprise crossed Ronan's face, quickly hidden. He was not used to being contradicted, especially not by someone so much smaller than him, someone new to the palace, someone whose name he did not even know. "And who are you to tell me what will happen to my own arm? I'm the person who is going to have to clean the infection out of it in 3 days if you don't let me look at it now," Illyra said evenly, "which sounds unpleasant for both of us." Garrick made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly disguised as a cough. Ronan shot him a sharp look before turning his attention back to Illyra, studying her with new interest, as if trying to work out what kind of person spoke to him this way. "Fine," he said at last, and he crossed the yard to sit on a low bench near the training equipment, holding out his arm without further argument. Illyra knelt beside him and began cleaning the wound, her hands steady, despite the unsettling closeness of the most feared man in the region. She worked in silence for a moment, and Ronan watched her with the same careful attention he might give an unfamiliar weapon, trying to determine whether it was dangerous. "You're new," he said finally. It was not a question. 3 days, Elira confirmed, not looking up from her work. "And already you've decided you can speak to me however you like." "I spoke to you about your arm," she said. "That's all." Ronan's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close to one. "Most people in this palace would not have argued with me." "I've noticed," Elira said, and something in her voice made it clear that this was not meant as a compliment. Ronan studied her for a long moment, sensing there was more behind the words than she was saying, but before he could press further, she finished wrapping the bandage and stood, brushing off her hands. "That should hold," she said. "Keep it clean, and it will heal without trouble." She turned to leave, but Ronan's voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned back, one eyebrow raised in silent question. "You said you've noticed," he said. "Noticed what?" For a moment, Elira considered saying nothing at all, considered simply walking away and letting the matter rest. But she thought again of Della, of 20 years of loyal service, erased in a single furious sentence, and she found she could not stay silent after all. "I noticed that people here are afraid of you," she said. "I noticed that you didn't ask a single question before you dismissed someone who has served this house for 20 years. Someone who had no idea an attack was coming. Someone who was only following orders given by your own steward. I noticed that being feared and being respected are not the same thing, though I imagine no one has told you that in quite some time." The training yard went very quiet. Garrick, who had been pretending not to listen, went suddenly and completely still. Somewhere behind them, a guard dropped a training sword, the clatter loud in the silence. Ronan's eyes, still faintly gold from the previous night's fighting, fixed on Elira, with an intensity that would have made most people take a step back. She held her ground, chin lifted, refusing to look away first. "You're speaking of Della," he said slowly. "I am." "You don't know the full circumstances." "I know that no one ever explained them to you, because you never asked," Elira said. "I know that a woman who gave 20 years of her life to this palace was thrown out into the night without so much as a chance to defend herself. Whether or not I know every detail, I know enough to see that you made a decision in anger, and anger is a poor foundation for justice, my king." For a long moment, Ronan said nothing at all. He simply stared at her, and she could not tell whether the look in his eyes was fury or something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. Finally, without another word, he rose from the bench and walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly out of the training yard and back toward the palace, leaving Elira standing alone with Garrick and a yard full of guards who were staring at her as though she had grown a second head. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Garrick asked quietly, once the king was out of earshot. "I told him the truth," Elira said, though her heart was pounding now that the moment had passed, now that the full weight of what she had just done was beginning to settle over her. "No one tells him the truth," Garrick said, shaking his head slowly, though there was something almost like admiration in his voice. "Not since his father died, not since he took the crown. People tell him what he wants to hear, because the alternative is—" He trailed off, glancing toward the palace, as if the rest of the sentence was too dangerous to say aloud. "The alternative is what?" Elira pressed. Garrick only shook his head again. "Watch yourself, healer. That's all I'll say. A king who has never been told no in his life does not always know what to do when someone finally says it." Elira thought about those words for the rest of the day, turning them over in her mind as she moved through her duties in the infirmary, checking on patients, preparing herbs, listening to Margaret's quiet instructions. She thought about the flicker of surprise she had seen in Ronan's eyes when she first spoke to him about his arm, and the deeper, harder-to-name expression that had crossed his face when she spoke of Della. She did not know what to make of either look, and she told herself firmly that it did not matter what she made of them. She was a healer's assistant. He was a king. Their paths would cross only rarely, and there was no reason to think about him at all, beyond the simple fact that she had, for reasons she still could not quite explain, decided to say what almost no one else in this palace dared to say. She did not know, as she went about the rest of her evening, that Ronan had not gone far after leaving the training yard. He had stopped at the edge of the courtyard, out of sight, and stood there for a long while, staring at nothing, her words echoing in his mind long after she had walked away. Being feared and being respected are not the same thing. No one had said such a thing to him in years. Not his advisors, who agreed with everything he decided the moment he decided it. Not his guards, who followed his orders without question, even when those orders were cruel. Not even his closest friends among the court, who had learned long ago that disagreeing with the Alpha King was a fast way to lose his favor. He thought of Della's face as he had spoken to her the previous night, the way her eyes had widened in shock and hurt, and for the first time since the confrontation, a small, uncomfortable feeling settled into his chest, something he did not immediately recognize, because it was a feeling he had almost no experience with at all. It would take him some time to understand that the feeling was doubt. It would take him even longer to understand what to do about it. But as he stood alone in the fading evening light, staring toward the infirmary where a sharp-tongued healer's assistant had spoken to him, with more honesty than anyone had offered in years, something inside him had already begun, slowly and reluctantly, to shift. Illyra did not think much more about the encounter as the days passed, or at least she told herself she did not. She busied herself with her work in the infirmary, learning the layout of the palace, memorizing the names of the staff who treated her kindly, and the few who eyed her with suspicion, for reasons she could not guess. She had grown up far from any royal court, in a small village near the northern hills, where her mother had taught her the basics of healing, before falling ill herself, an illness Illyra had not been able to cure no matter how hard she tried. It was Margaret who had found her afterward, half-starved and grieving, and who had taken her in, and taught her everything else she knew. Illyra owed the old healer a debt she could never fully repay, and when Margaret asked her to come to the palace to help manage the growing needs of the royal infirmary, she had agreed without hesitation, despite every warning she had heard about the temperament of the new king. She had expected arrogance. She had expected coldness. What she had not expected was the flicker of something uncertain she had seen in Ronan's eyes before he turned and walked away from her in the training yard, as though her words had actually reached him, as though some part of him had wanted to argue and could not find the argument. She pushed the thought aside each time it surfaced. It was not her business what the king felt or did not feel. She had a job to do, patients to tend, and a life to rebuild in this unfamiliar place. Whatever storm was brewing behind Ronan Blackthorn's golden eyes was not hers to weather. Word of the confrontation in the training yard spread through the palace faster than any illness Illyra had ever treated. By the following afternoon, half the staff seemed to know that the new healer's assistant had spoken back to the king and lived to tell about it, a feat that apparently placed her in a very small and select group. Some of the younger servants looked at her with something like awe when she passed. Others, older and more cautious, warned her quietly to be careful, to remember that even a king who had briefly seemed to listen could just as easily turn cruel again without warning. Della, for her part, had not yet left the grounds. She remained in her quarters, packing slowly, her movements heavy with grief for the home and the work she had loved for 2 decades. Illyra visited her twice, bringing food and quiet company, and each time she found the older woman a little more resigned to her fate, a little more convinced that nothing would change the king's decision now that it had been made. "He does not undo things," Della told her on the second visit, folding a worn shawl into a small trunk. "Not once he has decided. That is simply who he is." "Maybe no one has ever given him a reason to reconsider," Illyra said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them. Della only shook her head sadly and continued packing. That evening, restless and unable to settle into sleep, Illyra walked to the palace grounds alone, following a path along the outer gardens that Margaret had shown her days earlier. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of late-blooming flowers, and for a while she simply walked, letting her thoughts empty out into the quiet dark. It was there, near a low stone wall overlooking the training yard, that she saw him again. Ronan stood alone at the edge of the yard, no guards nearby, no advisors trailing behind him, simply standing in the moonlight with his back to her, so still that for a moment she thought he might be some kind of statue placed there among the hedges. She almost turned away, unwilling to intrude on whatever solitude he had sought out. But something in the set of his shoulders, some quality of stillness that felt closer to sorrow than strength, kept her rooted in place. She did not approach him. She had said enough for 1 week, she told herself, and there was no reason to risk another confrontation over a matter that was, after all, not truly hers to solve. And yet she found herself watching him for a long moment, before finally turning back toward the infirmary, wondering, despite every warning she had received, what exactly a king like Ronan Blackthorn thought about, when no one else was watching. 3 days after the confrontation in the training yard, Ronan summoned his steward, a thin, nervous man named Percival, to his study before dawn. He had not slept well in days, and the lack of rest had done nothing to improve his temper, though this morning his frustration was aimed inward, rather than at the people around him, a fact that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Tell me exactly what happened the night of the attack," Ronan said, without any greeting. "The guard reassignments. Who ordered them, and why?" Percival blinked, clearly startled by the question. "My king, I believed you already knew. I ordered the reassignment myself, to prepare the hall for the council meeting. Della simply relayed the instruction to the gate captain, as she does for all household matters." "You ordered it?" "Yes, my king. I did not anticipate any danger that night. There had been no warning, no sign of the rebels moving toward the palace. It was, I believed, a routine adjustment." Ronan sat in silence for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands folded on the desk before him. He thought of Della's face, the shock and hurt in her eyes, as he had accused her of a failure that was never hers to begin with. He thought of Alira's voice, steady and unflinching, telling him that he had made a decision in anger, without ever asking a single question. "Why did you not correct me?" Ronan asked finally, his voice quieter than Percival had ever heard it. "When I dismissed her, you were there. You knew the fault was yours." Percival's face went pale. "My king, I did not think it was my place to contradict you. Not in that moment. Not when you were so—" He trailed off, choosing his next word carefully. "Not when you were so certain." Ronan closed his eyes briefly. He understood, with a clarity that felt almost painful, exactly what Percival meant, and exactly why no one in this palace had ever dared to correct him, not even when correction was desperately needed. He had built, without ever intending to, a court full of people too afraid to tell him the truth, and in doing so, he had cost an innocent woman her home and her livelihood over a mistake that was never hers. "Find her," Ronan said. "Before she leaves the grounds, tell her I wish to speak with her." Percival hurried from the room, and Ronan sat alone for a long while afterward, staring at nothing, turning over in his mind the strange, uncomfortable weight of what he now had to do. He had never once, in all his years as heir and then king, admitted that he was wrong about anything. His father had raised him to believe that admitting fault was a doorway through which enemies could walk, that a king who showed weakness invited challenge, that strength meant never bending, never softening, never allowing anyone to see doubt in his eyes. He had believed this his entire life, had built his rule upon it, and yet sitting here now, thinking of Della's face and Alira's unflinching gaze, he found himself wondering, for the first time, whether his father had been wrong. Della arrived an hour later, escorted by Percival, her expression guarded and wary, as she stepped into the study. She had clearly expected further punishment, not an audience, and she stood near the door with her hands clasped tightly before her, waiting for whatever came next. Ronan rose from his desk and crossed the room slowly. He had rehearsed nothing, had no plan for what to say, and found himself standing before her with words that simply would not come, his throat tight in a way he did not recognize and did not like. "I spoke with Percival," he said finally, the words coming out stiffer than he intended. "The reassignment was his order. You were not at fault." Della's eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing, waiting. "I acted too quickly," Ronan continued, forcing the words out one by one, each one feeling foreign in his mouth, like a language he had never learned to speak. "I did not ask enough questions before I made my decision. That was—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to say the word that hovered just at the edge of his thoughts, refusing to be spoken aloud. Della waited a moment longer. Then, when it became clear he would not continue, she spoke gently. "Does this mean I may keep my position, my king?" "Yes," Ronan said quickly, relieved to have a simpler answer to give. "Of course. Return to your duties whenever you wish. There will be no further consequence." Della thanked him quietly and left the room, and Ronan stood alone once more, staring at the space where she had been, aware of a strange hollow feeling in his chest that he could not name. He had corrected the mistake. He had restored her position, reversed the punishment, done everything within his power to make the situation right again. And yet it did not feel finished. Some part of him understood, dimly, that restoring her job was not the same as the thing she actually deserved to hear, the thing he had not been able to force past his own lips, no matter how hard he tried. He thought of the word again. Sorry. 2 simple syllables that most people in the world seem to manage without difficulty, and yet, when he tried to imagine saying them aloud, his throat closed around the sound as though his own body were rejecting the idea entirely. He remembered, unwillingly, a memory from childhood that he had not thought of in years. He had been perhaps 8 years old, training with his father in this very palace, when he had struck another boy too hard during a sparring match, drawing blood from the boy's lip. He remembered starting to apologize, the word forming on his tongue, only for his father to grip his shoulder hard enough to bruise and pull him aside. "Blackthorns do not apologize," his father had told him, his voice low and hard. "An apology is an admission that you were weak enough to make a mistake in the first place. A king does not show weakness, not to his enemies, not to his court, and not to himself." He had carried that lesson with him for over 20 years, had built his entire understanding of strength and leadership around it, and now, standing alone in his study, with the memory of Della's grateful, uncertain face still fresh in his mind, he found himself wondering, for the first time in his life, whether his father had simply been wrong. He did not have an answer. He only had the growing, uncomfortable awareness that something inside him had shifted, some old and settled belief cracking open just slightly, letting in light he was not entirely sure he wanted to see. That evening, unable to settle his thoughts, he found himself once again standing at the edge of the training yard, staring out at nothing, when he heard soft footsteps approaching from the direction of the infirmary. He turned, already knowing before he saw her who it would be. Elira stopped a short distance away, clearly surprised to find him there again, though she did not turn to leave. "I heard Della kept her position," she said after a moment. "That was well done, my king." "It was the least I could do," Ronan said, and then, before he could stop himself, he added, "You were right. About the questions I should have asked." Elira's eyebrows lifted slightly, clear surprise crossing her features. "I did not expect you to admit that." "Neither did I," Ronan admitted, and for the first time since she had met him, Elira thought she saw something almost like humor flicker across his face, quickly gone, replaced by the same guarded seriousness he always carried. They stood in silence for a moment, the night air cool and quiet around them, neither quite willing to end the conversation, and neither quite certain how to continue it. "Good night, healer," Ronan said finally, and turned to walk back toward the palace, leaving Elira standing alone at the edge of the training yard, watching him go with an expression she could not entirely name, though it felt, unmistakably, like the first crack in a wall she had been very carefully building around herself since the moment she arrived. A full week passed before Elira and Ronan crossed paths again in any meaningful way, though Elira found herself more aware of his presence in the palace than she wanted to admit, catching sight of him across the courtyard, hearing his voice from council chambers as she passed, noticing the way conversations shifted whenever his name was spoken. She told herself repeatedly that this awareness meant nothing, that it was simply the natural curiosity anyone might feel toward a powerful and unpredictable ruler, and she nearly managed to believe it until the morning everything changed. It began with an accident during training. A young guard, practicing with live steel against Garrick's orders, lost control of his blade and struck Ronan across the forearm before anyone could stop him, opening a deep cut that bled freely down to his wrist. The training yard erupted into chaos, guards shouting, the young man responsible turning white with horror at what he had done, and within minutes, Ronan was half carried, half walked into the infirmary by 2 of his guards, blood soaking through the sleeve of his shirt. Margaret was away from the palace that day, tending to a difficult birth in the village below, which left Illyra alone to handle whatever came through the infirmary doors. She had trained for exactly this kind of situation, had handled worse injuries during her years with Margaret, and she moved without hesitation the moment Ronan was brought before her, directing the guards to set him on the examination table and clearing the room of everyone except the patient himself. "This needs stitches," she said, examining the wound with quick, careful hands. "It's deep, but it missed anything important. You're fortunate." "Fortunate," Ronan repeated, his voice tight with pain he was clearly trying not to show. "I don't feel particularly fortunate at the moment." "You will, once I've finished and you're not bleeding onto my floor," Illyra said, already reaching for the supplies she needed, moving through the familiar motions of preparing needle and thread with the ease of long practice. He watched her work, his golden eyes following her hands with an intensity that made her skin feel warm, despite the coolness of the infirmary. She tried to focus entirely on the wound before her, on the careful stitches she needed to place, but she was acutely, uncomfortably aware of how close he was, of the warmth radiating from his skin, of the low, steady sound of his breathing as she worked. "This will hurt," she warned him, threading the needle. "I don't have anything strong enough to fully numb the area, not without more time to prepare it." "I've survived worse," Ronan said simply, and did not so much as flinch as she began her work, though she noticed the muscles in his jaw tighten with each pass of the needle. They fell into silence as she worked, the only sounds the quiet clink of her instruments and the distant noise of the palace beyond the infirmary walls. It was in this silence, halfway through closing the wound, that Illyra made the mistake of looking up at his face at the exact moment he was looking down at her. What happened next was not something either of them could have explained afterward, not fully, not in any way that made complete sense. It was as though the air in the room shifted, grew thick and charged, every nerve in Illyra's body suddenly alive with an awareness so intense it nearly took her breath away. She felt something inside her chest lock into place, a sensation like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed, a pull so strong and so immediate that her hands actually trembled around the needle she held. Ronan felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes widened, the golden color flaring brighter for just a moment before he blinked and looked away, his entire body going rigid on the examination table. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Illyra forced herself to finish the last few stitches, though her hands were not entirely steady, and Ronan sat perfectly still, staring at the wall opposite him, as though it held answers to questions he did not yet know how to ask. "There," Illyra said finally, tying off the last stitch, her voice higher and tighter than she intended. "It should heal cleanly if you keep it clean, and rest the arm for a few days." Ronan did not move immediately. When he finally looked at her again, his expression was unreadable, guarded in a way that felt different from his usual coldness, something almost like fear hidden beneath the careful mask of a king. "You felt that," he said. It was not a question. Illyra considered denying it, considered pretending she had no idea what he meant, but the words would not come. The pull she had felt was undeniable, a physical certainty settling into her bones that she could not simply talk herself out of, no matter how much she wanted to. "Yes," she admitted quietly. Ronan rose from the table abruptly, testing the movement of his bandaged arm, his expression closing off entirely, retreating back behind the wall of authority and distance he wore like armor. "This changes nothing," he said, though the words sounded as much like a warning to himself as to her. "You will continue your duties as before. I have a kingdom to run, and I do not have time for—" He stopped, seeming unable to find the right word, or perhaps unwilling to say it aloud. "For a mate," Illyra finished for him, the word feeling strange and enormous in her mouth, though she forced herself to say it plainly, rather than let it hang unspoken between them. Ronan's jaw tightened at the word, and for a moment, he said nothing at all. "This is not something either of us chose," he said finally. "It does not mean we are obligated to act on it." "No," Illyra agreed, though something in her chest ached slightly at the flat certainty in his voice. "It doesn't." He left the infirmary without another word, his stride quick and purposeful, and Illyra stood alone amid her scattered supplies, staring at the door long after he had gone, her heart still racing from the strange, undeniable pull that had settled into place between them, a bond neither of them had asked for, and neither of them, it seemed, was prepared to accept. She did not tell Margaret when the old healer returned that evening, though she suspected Margaret noticed something different in her manner, a distraction that had not been there before. She went about her duties as usual, checked on her patients, prepared her herbs, ate a quiet dinner alone in her small room off the infirmary, and all the while, a low, persistent awareness hummed beneath her thoughts, a sense of Ronan's presence, somewhere within the palace walls, that she could not shake, no matter how hard she tried to ignore it. She had heard of the mating bond before, of course. Everyone had. It was spoken of in stories, in songs, as the most treasured gift a person could receive, a guarantee of a partner perfectly matched to complete them in every way. She had never expected to experience it herself, had assumed, given the quiet, unremarkable life she led, that such things were reserved for people of greater fortune than her own. She certainly had never imagined that if it did happen, her fated match would be the most feared ruler in the region, a man capable of destroying a woman's 20 years of service without a single moment of hesitation. And yet here she was, lying awake in the dark, unable to stop thinking about the way his eyes had widened when the bond snapped into place, the flicker of vulnerability she had seen beneath his carefully constructed mask, gone as quickly as it had appeared, but undeniably real while it lasted. Across the palace, in his own chambers, Ronan was faring no better. He sat by the window of his room long after the household had gone quiet, staring out at the moonlit grounds, his bandaged arm resting against his chest, his thoughts circling endlessly around the same impossible fact. He had a mate, a healer's assistant with sharp words and sharper eyes, a woman who had challenged him more directly than anyone had dared in years, a woman utterly unimpressed by his crown or his reputation. He thought of everything he had built since taking the throne, the careful control he had maintained over every aspect of his rule, the reputation for strength and ruthlessness that kept enemies at bay and allies in line. A mate was a vulnerability. A mate was a weakness an enemy could exploit, a tether that could be used against him, a bond that made him accountable to another person's well-being in a way he had never allowed himself to be accountable to anyone. And yet, beneath all of that careful reasoning, beneath every argument he could construct for why this bond was inconvenient, even dangerous, there was a quieter thought he could not fully silence, a thought that whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, being tethered to someone who told him the truth without fear was not the weakness his father had always warned him against, but something else entirely, something he did not yet have the courage to name. He did not sleep that night, neither did Elira, and though neither of them spoke of it again for several days, the bond between them settled deeper with each passing hour, quiet and patient, and utterly impossible to ignore, waiting for the moment when one of them, or perhaps both, would finally stop fighting against it. For the next several days, Ronan threw himself into the affairs of his kingdom with a ferocity that left his advisors both impressed and slightly alarmed. He sat through council meetings that normally bored him without complaint, reviewed reports on the rebel movements along the northern border with unusual patience, and even agreed to meet personally with a delegation of merchants whose concerns he would normally have delegated to Percival without a second thought. He told himself this sudden burst of diligence had nothing to do with avoiding the infirmary, nothing to do with the persistent, maddening awareness of Elira Hart that hummed beneath his thoughts no matter how hard he tried to focus on anything else. It did not work particularly well. Even in the middle of council discussions about grain shipments and border patrols, some small part of his mind remained tuned to the direction of the infirmary, as though an invisible thread connected him to her location within the palace at all times. He found himself wondering what she was doing, whether she had eaten, whether the persistent cough he had heard from one of the stable hands the week before had improved under her care. These thoughts arrived unbidden and unwelcome, and he pushed them aside each time with the same stubborn determination he applied to every other problem in his life, refusing to acknowledge that this particular problem might not respond to sheer force of will. Garrick, who had served under Ronan long enough to recognize when something was troubling him, finally raised the subject directly one evening as the two of them reviewed guard rotations in Ronan's study. "You've been different this week," Garrick said, not looking up from the schedule in his hands. More focused, less inclined to throw things at the wall when a report displeases you. Is that a complaint? Ronan asked dryly. An observation, Garrick said. One that started around the same time you visited the infirmary with that cut on your arm. Ronan's expression shuddered immediately, and Garrick, wise enough to recognize the warning signs of a conversation his king did not wish to continue, returned his attention to the schedule without further comment. But the seed had been planted, and Ronan found himself unable to stop thinking about it for the remainder of the evening. He knew, of course, exactly what had happened in that infirmary. He was not a fool, whatever else people might say about his temper. He understood what the sudden, undeniable pull between himself and Alira meant, understood the significance of a bond that could not be forced or faked, understood that fate itself had apparently decided, with no regard for his own preferences or plans, that this particular healer's assistant was meant to stand beside him for the rest of his life. The trouble was that everything he had ever been taught about strength and leadership stood directly opposed to the vulnerability such a bond represented. His father, Edmund Blackthorne, had ruled for nearly 30 years before his death, and had done so through sheer, unyielding force of will, never once allowing weakness to show, never once permitting anyone close enough to threaten his authority. Edmund had taken a mate himself, Ronan's own mother, but their bond had been a distant, formal thing, more political alliance than partnership, and Ronan had grown up watching two people who shared a fated connection live almost entirely separate lives within the same palace walls. He had assumed, without ever fully examining the assumption, that this was simply how such bonds worked for people like him, people born to rule, people who could not afford the luxury of genuine closeness with another person. Love, in his father's teachings, was a story told to comfort common folk, not a reality available to kings. And yet the pull he had felt in that infirmary had been nothing like the distant formality he had witnessed between his parents. It had been immediate, overwhelming, a physical certainty that had nearly stolen the breath from his lungs. He did not know what to do with a feeling that powerful, had no framework for understanding it, and the not knowing left him restless and irritable in a way that had nothing to do with the healing wound on his arm. He found himself, several nights later, standing once again at the edge of the training yard, staring toward the infirmary, as though he might catch sight of her through the darkened windows. He told himself he was simply taking evening air, that his presence in this particular spot had nothing to do with proximity to a certain sharp-tongued healer, but the lie felt thin even to his own ears. It was Alira, in the end, who broke the silence between them, though not through any grand gesture or planned confrontation. She had been walking the same garden path she often took in the evenings, seeking quiet after a long day, tending to a fever that had swept through the younger staff, when she spotted him standing at the training yard's edge, unmistakably waiting, though for what she could not say. She hesitated only a moment before approaching, telling herself firmly that avoiding him entirely would only make the situation more awkward in the long run, and that as fated mates, whether either of them liked the arrangement or not, they would need to find some way to coexist within the same palace. "You're avoiding the infirmary," she said, coming to stand a respectful distance away. Ronan did not turn immediately. "I have a kingdom to run. My presence is required elsewhere." "That's not an answer to what I said." He finally turned to face her, and in the dim light of the moon, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful, controlled way he held himself, as though bracing against some invisible force. "What would you have me say, healer? That I don't know what to do with this bond any more than you seem to? That I have spent my entire life being told that closeness of this kind is a weakness a king cannot afford?" The honesty of the admission surprised her, and for a moment, she did not know how to respond. "That sounds like a lonely way to live," she said finally. "It is the only way I have known," Ronan said simply. They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them charged with everything neither of them was quite ready to say. Alira thought of her own life, of the quiet, steady work of healing that had given her purpose after her mother's death, of the careful walls she had built around her own heart to protect against further loss. She understood, perhaps better than she wanted to admit, the impulse to keep the world at a careful distance. "I'm not asking you to declare anything," she said at last. I'm not even certain I want this bond any more than you seem to. But pretending it doesn't exist, avoiding entire wings of your own palace to escape it, that seems like a poor solution for either of us. Ronan considered this for a long moment. What would you suggest instead? That we simply continue as we were, Alira said. You attend to your kingdom. I attend to my patients. If our paths cross, they cross, and we deal with whatever that means as it comes, rather than as some enormous problem to be solved all at once. It was, Ronan realized, a remarkably sensible suggestion, offered without any of the drama or expectation he had braced himself to encounter. He found himself studying her in the moonlight, struck once again by the same quality that had first caught his attention in the training yard days earlier, the way she spoke to him without fear, without flattery, simply as one person addressing another. Very well, he said finally. We continue as we were. Alira nodded, though something in her chest ached slightly at the simplicity of the agreement. Some small, unexpected disappointment she did not fully understand and was not prepared to examine too closely. Good night, my king, she said, and turned to walk back toward the infirmary, leaving him once again alone at the edge of the training yard. He did not call after her, though he found his eyes following her retreating figure for far longer than he intended, some quiet, insistent part of him wishing she had stayed a little longer, wishing the conversation had gone differently, though he could not have said exactly how. Over the following days, they settled into an uneasy rhythm, crossing paths occasionally in the corridors, exchanging brief, careful words whenever duty brought them into proximity, both of them maintaining a distance that felt, to anyone watching, like simple professional courtesy. Only the two of them knew the effort such distance required, the constant, low hum of awareness that neither could fully silence, no matter how hard they tried. And beneath it all, unnoticed by either of them at first, something else had begun to stir in Ronan's thoughts. A quieter, more persistent discomfort that had nothing to do with the bond itself. It was the memory of Della's face, still fresh, despite the passage of days, the knowledge that restoring her position had not been enough, that some deeper debt remained unpaid, a debt made of two simple words he still could not force himself to speak aloud, even now, even after everything. 10 days after the bond had settled between them, word reached the palace that the rebels who had attacked during the night of the fire were regrouping in greater numbers along the northern border, joined now by outcasts from 2 neighboring territories who had grown resentful of Ronan's father's old policies and saw in the young king's inexperience an opportunity to strike. The council convened in the great hall, and for the first time since taking the throne, Ronan found himself facing a threat serious enough to require the full attention of every advisor, every guard captain, every resource the kingdom possessed. Alira heard the news from Margaret, who had heard it from one of the kitchen staff, who had heard it from a guard who should not have been speaking of council matters at all, but rumors traveled through palace corridors faster than any official announcement ever could. She felt a tightening in her chest at the news that had nothing to do with general concern for the kingdom's safety and everything to do with a specific, unwelcome awareness of Ronan's presence at the center of whatever conflict was coming. A bond she had not asked for making his safety matter to her in ways she still had not fully accepted. She told herself this concern was simply practical. If the rebels attacked again, the infirmary would need to prepare for casualties, would need extra supplies, extra hands, careful planning for whatever wounds might come through its doors. She threw herself into these preparations with focused determination, cataloging herbs and bandages, training 2 of the younger kitchen staff in basic wound care in case the infirmary became overwhelmed, working long hours that left little room for thoughts of golden eyes and careful, guarded conversations in moonlit gardens. It did not entirely work. Late one evening, exhausted from a day spent preparing the infirmary, she found herself walking past the great hall just as the council meeting broke apart, advisors filing out with grim, tired expressions, and there, at the center of it all, stood Ronan, looking as exhausted as she felt, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed heavier than any physical burden. He caught sight of her before she could retreat, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the corridor around them slowly emptying as the last of the advisors departed toward their own quarters. "You've heard then," Ronan said, once they were alone. "The whole palace has heard," Alira replied. kitchen staff make poor secret keepers. A faint, tired smile touched his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. We march north in 4 days. The rebels have gathered a force larger than anything my father ever faced in his years of rule. If they are not stopped now, before they can gather further strength, the entire region will be at risk. You intend to lead the fight yourself. I am the king, Ronan said simply, as though this explained everything, and perhaps, Illyra thought, it did. She did not know what compelled her to say what she said next, some combination of exhaustion and worry, and the persistent, unwelcome tug of the bond that made his safety feel like her own. You could send Garrick. He is more than capable. Garrick is capable, Ronan agreed, but a king who sends others to fight his battles while he remains safe behind palace walls is not a king his people will follow for long. I will not ask my guards to risk what I am unwilling to risk myself. There was something almost admirable in the stubbornness of this answer, though it did nothing to ease the tight knot of worry that had settled in Illyra's chest since first hearing the news. Then I suppose the infirmary will need to be ready for whatever comes back through these doors, she said, her voice carefully steady. Ronan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes. You worry for me, he said finally, and it was not quite a question. I worry for everyone who marches north, Illyra said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely honest, knew that the particular quality of her worry regarding Ronan Blackthorn had a sharper edge than any general concern for the safety of strangers. That's not what I asked. She met his gaze directly, refusing to look away despite the sudden vulnerability of the moment. Yes, she admitted quietly. I worry for you specifically. I don't entirely know what to do with that worry, given everything else standing between us, but I won't pretend it isn't there. Something shifted in Ronan's expression at her honesty, a softening she had not seen from him before, quickly masked, but not quite quick enough to hide entirely. I did not expect that admission, he said. Neither did I, Illyra said, and for a moment, standing together in the quiet, emptying corridor, the careful distance they had maintained since their agreement in the garden seemed to thin, some invisible barrier growing more fragile with each passing second. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them. Whatever pull existed, whatever bond fate had decided to place upon them, both were still too guarded, too uncertain, too shaped by their separate histories of loss and caution, to simply surrender to it. But something had changed in the acknowledgement, some quiet shift that neither could have named but both could feel, a small crack in the careful walls each had built to keep the other at arm's length. I should return to my preparations, Illyra said finally, breaking the silence. The infirmary will not stock itself. Of course, Ronan said, and there was something almost reluctant in the way he stepped back to let her pass, as though some part of him wished to extend the conversation further, despite every instinct telling him such closeness was dangerous. She walked away without looking back, though she could feel his eyes on her the entire length of the corridor, and it was not until she reached the safety of the infirmary, alone with her herbs and bandages, and the steady, familiar rhythm of her work, that she allowed herself to acknowledge the full weight of what she had just admitted, both to him and to herself. Over the following days, the palace transformed into a hive of preparation, guards drilling in the training yard from dawn until dusk, supply carts loaded with provisions for the march north, messengers riding out to allied territories to request additional support. Illyra barely saw Ronan during this time, catching only occasional glimpses of him crossing the courtyard, deep in conversation with Garrick or one of his other advisors, his expression permanently set in the grim, focused lines of a man preparing for war. She threw herself into her own preparations with equal intensity, training her small team of assistants until she was confident they could handle whatever wounds might come through the infirmary doors, stockpiling every herb and bandage the palace stores could provide, reviewing again and again the treatments Margaret had taught her for the kinds of injuries battle typically produced. On the evening before the army was set to march, she found herself unable to sleep, restless with an anxiety she told herself was simply professional concern, but that she knew, deep down, ran far deeper than that. She walked the palace grounds again, following the familiar path past the training yard, and found, unsurprisingly, that Ronan was there as well, standing alone in the moonlight, staring out toward the northern hills where the rebel forces were gathering. "You should be resting," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I could say the same to you," Ronan replied, not taking his eyes from the horizon. They stood together in silence for a while, and Alira found herself studying his profile in the moonlight, the tension in his jaw, the careful stillness of a man who had learned long ago to hide his fear behind a mask of unyielding strength. She thought of everything she had learned about him since arriving at this palace, the harsh, sudden judgment that had cost Della her position, the surprising willingness to admit fault once the truth had been laid before him, the flicker of vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his careful control. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, that the question had pushed too far past the careful boundaries they had maintained. But finally, his voice low and rough, he spoke. "Yes," he admitted. "Though I could not say that to anyone else in this palace. A king who admits fear invites doubt, and doubt among my people is a danger I cannot afford, not with rebels gathering at our borders." "You can say it to me," Alira said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever else stands between us, I am not looking to use your fear against you." Ronan turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression that she had never seen from him before, not even in the intimacy of the infirmary when the bond had first settled between them. "Why does that matter to you?" he asked. "I have given you little reason to care what happens to me. You gave Della a second chance," Alira said. "You listened, even when it cost you something to admit you were wrong. That matters more than you seem to realize." He said nothing for a long moment, simply studying her face in the moonlight, and Alira found herself holding her breath, uncertain what would come next, aware of the bond humming steadily between them, patient and persistent, despite every effort either of them had made to keep it at bay. "Return safely," she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel unbearable. "The infirmary will be ready for whatever comes, but I would rather not need to use it for you." A faint, genuine smile touched Ronan's mouth, the first true smile she had seen from him since arriving at the palace. "I will do my best not to disappoint you, healer." She left him standing there in the moonlight, and though neither of them spoke of it again before the army marched north the following morning, something had shifted between them in that quiet, honest exchange, a small but undeniable step closer to the bond that fate had placed upon them, however unwilling either of them still felt to fully surrender to it. The battle at the northern border lasted 3 days, fought across rocky hills and dense forest, where the rebel forces had chosen their ground carefully, hoping the terrain would offset their disadvantage in numbers and training. Ronan fought at the front of his forces throughout, refusing every suggestion that he retreat to safety while his guards held the line, and by the time the rebels finally broke and scattered into the hills, the cost of victory had been steep on both sides. Word reached the palace ahead of the returning army, carried by exhausted messengers who brought news of the victory alongside grim reports of the wounded and the dead. Alira had little time to process the relief of knowing Ronan had survived before the infirmary doors opened to the first wave of injured soldiers, and for the next 2 days she barely slept, moving from patient to patient with Margaret and her small team of assistants, cleaning wounds, setting bones, and in a few heartbreaking cases, simply sitting with dying men who could not be saved, offering what comfort she could as they slipped away. It was during this exhausting stretch of work that she learned, through fragments of conversation between recovering soldiers, of an incident during the second day of fighting that had left the camp buzzing with quiet, uneasy talk. A young guard named Corwin, barely older than 18, had been given the task of guarding a supply route that the rebels had unexpectedly outflanked, resulting in the loss of critical provisions and nearly cutting off Ronan's forces from their supply lines entirely. In the chaos of the moment, Ronan had turned on Corwin with the same explosive fury he had once directed at Della, accusing him publicly of cowardice and incompetence in front of the assembled soldiers, stripping him of his rank on the spot, before storming off to reorganize the defense. It was only afterward, once the immediate crisis had passed, that the truth emerged. Corwin had, in fact, sent 2 separate warnings up the chain of command about the rebel movement he had spotted, warnings that had been lost or ignored, somewhere between the front lines and Ronan's command tent due to the chaos of battle. The young guard had done everything correctly. The failure belonged to the communication breakdown, not to him. Illyra heard this story from a wounded soldier she was treating, a man who had fought beside Corwin, and spoke of the young guard's humiliation with quiet anger. He didn't deserve that, the soldier said, wincing as Illyra cleaned a gash along his shoulder. Corwin's a good soldier. Followed every order right. The king just needed someone to blame in the moment, and Corwin was standing closest. Illyra said nothing in response, but the story settled heavily in her chest, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist with disappointment. She had hoped, after everything that had happened with Della, after the small, hard-won growth she had witnessed in Ronan during their conversations, that perhaps he had learned something lasting from that first mistake. Hearing that he had repeated the same pattern under the pressure of battle left her uncertain whether that earlier lesson had truly taken root at all, or whether it had simply been a momentary lapse in an otherwise unchanged nature. The army returned to the palace 3 days later, weary and battle-worn but victorious, and the following morning, once the wounded had been settled and the initial chaos of homecoming had faded, Ronan sought Illyra out in the infirmary, finding her alone during a rare quiet moment between patients. He looked different than she remembered, exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, a fresh scar along his jaw that had not been there before he marched north. But it was not his physical state that caught her attention. It was the heaviness in his posture, the same uncomfortable weight she had noticed in him once before, in the days after Della's dismissal. "You've heard about Corwin," he said, without preamble. "The whole palace has heard," Illyra replied, echoing her earlier words about the rebel attack, though there was less warmth in her voice this time. Ronan's jaw tightened, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes directly. "I know what you're thinking." "Do you?" Illyra asked, setting aside the bandages she had been folding to give him her full attention. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks very much like you did the exact same thing you did to Della, only this time in front of an entire army." "I know," Ronan said, and the simple, immediate admission surprised her, a marked difference from the defensiveness she had half expected. "I have already restored his rank. I did that the moment the truth reached me, before we even began the march home." "Restoring his rank isn't the same as making things right," Illyra said, and even as she spoke the words, she recognized them as an echo of the very lesson he had seemed to learn once already, a lesson that apparently needed relearning under the pressure of crisis. Ronan was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides in a way that suggested some internal struggle she could not fully see. "I know that too," he said finally, his voice low. "I have thought of little else since the moment I learned the truth." Restoring his rank felt necessary, but insufficient. "There is something more I owe him, something I have not yet managed to give." Illyra's frustration softened slightly at the raw honesty in his voice, the clear evidence that this time, at least, he was not simply moving past the mistake without reflection. "You mean an apology?" she said. "I mean, I do not know how," Ronan admitted, and the words seemed to cost him something significant to say aloud, his shoulders tightening as though bracing against an old, familiar pain. "I have never in my life said those words to another person. Not once. My father taught me that such words were a weakness no king could afford, and I have carried that lesson so deeply that I find I do not even know how to begin, even when I understand, clearly and completely, that I am wrong." The admission hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than anything Ronan had shared with her before, and Illyra felt something in her chest soften further at the evident struggle behind his words. This was not a man refusing to acknowledge fault, she realized. This was a man who had never been given the tools to express that acknowledgement, who had spent his entire life building walls against a vulnerability he had been taught to fear above all else. "It's simply words," she said gently. "You go to him, and you tell him plainly that you were wrong, that you should not have accused him publicly without first knowing the truth, and that you regret the harm it caused him." "It sounds simple when you say it," Ronan said, a faint, humorless smile touching his mouth. "And yet I find myself entirely unable to imagine actually saying such words aloud, to him or to anyone." Illyra studied him for a long moment, an idea forming slowly in her mind, though she did not share it with him yet, uncertain whether it would even help, or whether it might simply embarrass him further. "Perhaps it takes practice," she said instead, "like anything else worth doing well." Ronan looked at her curiously, clearly turning the suggestion over in his mind, though he said nothing more on the subject, before excusing himself to attend to the many other duties awaiting a king returned from battle. Elira watched him go, and long after he had disappeared down the corridor, she found herself thinking about the raw vulnerability she had glimpsed in his admission, the image of a man who had spent his entire life being taught that two simple words were a weakness beyond his ability to afford, now standing at the edge of finally, painfully, learning otherwise. 3 days passed before Ronan worked up the resolve to attempt what Elira had suggested. He had turned her words over in his mind again and again, practice, like anything else worth doing well, and though the idea felt strange, even faintly ridiculous for a man of his position, he found he had no better plan for overcoming the strange paralysis that gripped him whenever he imagined standing before Corwin and speaking the words he knew he owed the young guard. He chose an old, disused chamber on the palace's western side for his attempt, a room once used for storing ceremonial armor that had since been moved elsewhere, leaving behind only dusty shelves and a single narrow window that let in thin afternoon light. It was private, unlikely to be visited by anyone during the middle of the day when the rest of the household staff were occupied with their duties, and Ronan had chosen the timing deliberately, wanting absolutely no witnesses to whatever awkward, uncertain attempt he was about to make. He stood alone in the center of the room, arms crossed, staring at the empty space before him as though Corwin himself might materialize there, simply through the force of his concentration. He cleared his throat, feeling foolish already, and began. "Corwin, I wish to speak with you about the incident at the northern border." He stopped immediately, grimacing at how stiff and formal the words sounded, more suited to a council address than an honest apology. He shook his head and began again. "I was wrong to accuse you as I did. Better, he thought, though something still felt incomplete. He continued, "I acted without knowing the full truth, and that was—" He stopped again, the next word catching in his throat exactly as it had every time he had attempted to say it before. He tried to force it out, felt his jaw tighten involuntarily, and found himself instead saying, "That was an error in judgment." He stood in silence for a moment, frustrated with himself. An error in judgment was not the same as admitting fault directly, was not the word Elira had used, the simple, direct word his father had taught him to avoid his entire life. He began pacing the length of the small chamber, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor, muttering under his breath as he tried different combinations of words, searching for a version of the apology that would let him finally push past whatever invisible wall stood between his intentions and his voice. "I regret the harm caused," he tried, pacing toward the window. "No, I am sorry for the harm caused." He stopped abruptly, staring at nothing, testing the shape of the word in his mouth, sorry, feeling how foreign and uncomfortable it sat there, like a stone he had swallowed and could not quite dislodge. He tried again, pacing back across the room. "Corwin, I am sorry. I was wrong to accuse you publicly, and I regret the damage that caused to your honor among the men." He paused, considering the words, and then shook his head sharply, dissatisfied. "No, that still sounds like an excuse wrapped around an apology, rather than an apology itself." He tried once more, this time forcing himself to slow down, to speak the words plainly, without the formal cadence he used for addressing his court. "I was wrong. I'm sorry. You did nothing to deserve what I said to you, and I should have asked more questions before I spoke." He stopped, considering this version, nodding slowly to himself, though he immediately began worrying over whether it sounded sincere enough, or perhaps too simple, or perhaps he needed to explain further why the mistake had happened in the first place. He was so thoroughly absorbed in his pacing and muttering, so entirely focused on the impossible task of finding the right combination of words, that he did not hear the soft creak of the door opening behind him, did not notice the footsteps that paused just inside the threshold, did not realize he had an audience, until a familiar voice spoke from behind him. That last version was quite good. Ronan spun around so quickly he nearly lost his balance, his face flushing with a heat he had not experienced since he was a boy, caught misbehaving by his father. Elira stood just inside the doorway, a basket of dried herbs balanced against her hip, having clearly wandered into this disused wing of the palace searching for storage space for the infirmary's overflow supplies, only to stumble upon something far more unexpected than empty shelves. For a long, mortifying moment, neither of them spoke. Ronan stood frozen in the middle of the room, caught mid-pace, his mouth still half open around whatever word he had been about to attempt next, and Alira stood in the doorway, clearly torn between the overwhelming urge to laugh and the awareness that laughing might permanently damage whatever fragile progress he had been making. "How long have you been standing there?" Ronan said finally, his voice tight with embarrassment. "Long enough to hear at least 4 different attempts," Alira admitted, setting her basket down carefully on a nearby shelf, buying herself a moment to compose her expression into something more neutral. "The third one was better than the first 2. Though I think you were overcomplicating the 4th. Ronan's jaw worked silently for a moment, caught somewhere between mortification and the strange, unfamiliar urge to simply laugh at the absurdity of his own situation. A king of considerable power and reputation, caught pacing an empty storage room, muttering apologies to no one. "This is not something I intended anyone to witness," he said finally, his voice stiff with wounded dignity. "I gathered that," Alira said, though there was gentleness beneath the amusement in her voice now, a softening that told him she was not, in fact, planning to mock him for what she had seen. "For what it's worth, I don't think less of you for practicing. I think it's rather remarkable, actually, that you're trying at all." Ronan looked at her carefully, searching her expression for any sign of mockery, and finding none, only that same steady, honest attentiveness he had come to associate with her, the quality that had first caught his attention in the training yard weeks earlier. "It should not be this difficult," he said, frustration bleeding into his voice. "It is 2 words. Children manage it without effort. Children haven't spent their entire lives being taught that those 2 words are a weakness," Alira said gently, crossing the room to stand a short distance from him. "You're not failing at something simple, Ronan. You're unlearning something you were taught your entire life, and that is never simple, no matter how small the thing itself might seem." It was the first time she had used his name without the formal title attached, and something in the sound of it, spoken plainly, without the weight of ceremony, seemed to ease some of the tension in his shoulders. He studied her for a long moment, and then, almost against his own will, a faint, rueful smile touched his mouth. "You must think me thoroughly ridiculous," he said. "The Alpha King, feared throughout the region, unable to manage a single sincere sentence, without rehearsing it alone, in an abandoned storage room." "I think you're trying," Alira said simply. "That matters more than you seem to realize. Most people who cause harm never bother to try at all. They simply move on, secure in their own certainty, and leave the people they've hurt to carry the weight alone. You're standing here, practicing, because you actually want to get it right. That's not ridiculous, that's rare." Something in her words settled deep in Ronan's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the earlier heat of embarrassment, something closer to the quiet, steady comfort of being truly seen and not found wanting despite it. He held her gaze for a long moment, the space between them charged with an intimacy neither of them had quite allowed before, not even in the honest exchange the night before the army marched north. "Will you help me?" he said finally, the request costing him something to voice aloud, an admission of need he was not accustomed to making to anyone. "I do not seem capable of finding the right words alone." Alira considered this for a moment and then nodded. "Say it to me first," she suggested. "Practice on someone before you attempt it with Corwin himself. Sometimes it helps to say difficult things to a friendly audience before facing the person who actually deserves to hear them." Ronan hesitated, the old instinct to guard himself rising immediately, but he pushed past it, understanding, on some level he could not fully articulate, that this moment mattered, that the trust required to attempt something so difficult in front of another person was itself a kind of bridge across the distance the bond had created between them. He took a breath, steadying himself, and looked directly at her rather than at the empty space he had been addressing before. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the formal cadence he had been trying to force earlier. "I acted out of fear and frustration in the middle of battle, and I placed that fear onto someone who did not deserve it. I am sorry for the harm I caused, and I intend to make certain it does not happen again." The words settled into the quiet room, simple and unadorned, and Alira felt something warm bloom in her chest at the sight of him, this powerful, guarded man, finally managing to say aloud what had eluded him for so long. "That was good," she said softly. "That was very good, Ronan." He exhaled slowly, some visible tension leaving his shoulders, and for a moment, they simply stood together in the dusty afternoon light, the space between them feeling smaller than it had in weeks, the careful distance they had both maintained since the bond first settled between them, thinning further with each passing second. "Thank you," Ronan said quietly, and though he was speaking of her help with the words, something in his tone suggested a gratitude that reached far beyond this single afternoon, beyond this single apology still waiting to be spoken to Corwin, something closer to gratitude for her presence itself, for the strange, unexpected gift of someone who saw his struggle and chose kindness rather than judgment. Alira found herself smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her entire face, and Ronan thought, not for the first time, that the mating bond fate had placed upon him might not be the weakness his father had always warned him against after all. The afternoon in the storage room marked a quiet turning point between them, though neither spoke of it directly in the days that followed. Something had shifted, a wall lowered just enough to let genuine warmth pass through, where before there had been only careful distance and unwilling awareness. Ronan found himself seeking Alira out more often, not with any specific purpose beyond simply wanting her company, and Alira, though she told herself repeatedly that she should maintain her professional distance, found she no longer wished to. It was during one of these quiet evenings, walking together along the garden path that had become an unspoken meeting place between them, that Ronan finally spoke of his father in a way he had never allowed himself to speak of him before, not even to Garrick, who had known him since childhood. "He was not a cruel man," Ronan said, staring out at the darkening sky as they walked. "Not in the way people sometimes imagine cruelty. He never raised a hand against me, never spoke to me with contempt. But he believed, with absolute certainty, that a king's strength was measured by how little he needed from anyone else. Emotion, closeness, admission of fault, he saw all of it as a kind of erosion, a wearing away of the hard edges a ruler needed to survive." Alira listened quietly, sensing that interrupting would only make it harder for him to continue, that this was a story he needed to tell in his own time, in his own way. "I remember the day he taught me that lesson clearly," Ronan continued. "I was 8 years old, sparring with another boy, the son of one of the household guards. I struck too hard, split his lip, and I remember feeling immediately, instinctively sorry, the word already forming before I even understood what had happened. My father pulled me aside before I could say it. He told me that Blackthorns do not apologize, that an apology is an admission of weakness no king can afford." "That's a heavy thing to teach a child," Alira said softly. "It was effective," Ronan said, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "I never apologized again, not once, not for anything, not even when I knew I was wrong. I told myself it was strength. I told myself my father understood something essential about leadership that softer men never grasped. It was only recently, only in these past weeks, that I began to wonder whether he had simply been wrong, and whether I had spent my entire life building my strength on a foundation that was never sound to begin with." He fell silent, and Alira, watching the tension in his jaw, the careful way he held himself even now, even in this moment of unusual openness, felt a deep ache of sympathy for the boy he had once been, the child taught so thoroughly to distrust his own kindness that he had spent decades treating basic human decency as a dangerous indulgence. "My mother taught me something different," she said, offering her own story in exchange for the vulnerability he had just shown her. "She was not a powerful woman, not wealthy, not important to anyone beyond our small village. But she used to say that apologizing was not about admitting you were less than someone else. It was about caring more about the relationship than about your own pride. She said pride was cheap and easily replaced, but trust, once broken, was much harder to rebuild, and that a person who valued their relationships would always choose honesty over the comfort of never admitting fault." "She sounds wise," Ronan said quietly. "She was," Alira agreed, a familiar ache settling into her chest at the memory. "She died when I was young, an illness I could not cure. no matter how hard I tried, no matter what Margaret and I attempted. I think that's part of why I became a healer in the first place, some part of me still trying to save her, even though she's been gone for years now. Ronan turned to look at her, something gentle and understanding in his expression, an acknowledgement of shared grief that required no further words. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time the word came easily, naturally, without the strain that had marked every previous attempt she had witnessed. "For your loss. She would be proud, I think, of the healer you've become." Elira felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, surprised by the sudden rush of emotion his simple, sincere words had brought. "Thank you," she said softly. They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the space between them warmer now, easier, the careful distance they had both maintained since the bond first settled between them, continuing to thin with each shared confidence. Ronan found himself thinking, as they walked, that this was perhaps the first genuinely honest conversation he had shared with another person since his father's death, the first time he had spoken of his childhood without the careful editing he applied to every other interaction within the palace walls. "I spoke with Corwin this morning," he said finally, breaking the comfortable quiet between them. "I said the words we practiced. It was not perfect. I stumbled twice, but I managed to say them, and he accepted the apology with more grace than I deserved." "How do you feel?" Elira asked. Ronan considered the question seriously, as though genuinely searching for the honest answer, rather than simply offering whatever response felt expected. "Lighter," he said finally, sounding almost surprised by his own conclusion. "I did not expect that. I have spent my entire life believing that admitting fault would diminish me somehow, would carve away at whatever strength I possessed. Instead, I find I feel more solid than I have in years, as though I have set down a weight I did not realize I was carrying." "That's often how it works," Elira said, a small, warm smile touching her mouth. "The things we're most afraid to say are usually the things that free us most once we finally say them." Ronan looked at her for a long moment, the moonlight catching the gentle curve of her smile, and he felt, with sudden and undeniable clarity, that whatever fear he had once carried about the mating bond fate had placed upon him was beginning to feel less like a threat to his carefully constructed strength, and more like the first genuine gift he had received since taking the crown. He did not say this aloud, not yet, uncertain whether the words would come any easier than the apology he had struggled so long to voice, but he thought it, clearly and completely, and the thought settled into his chest with a warmth that felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely welcome. They reached the edge of the garden where their paths would normally diverge, Elira toward the infirmary, and Ronan back toward the palace proper, and for a moment, they simply stood together, neither quite ready to end the evening, both sensing that something important had passed between them tonight, something that had shifted the ground beneath the careful arrangement they had agreed upon weeks earlier. "Good night, Ronan," Elira said finally, using his name again, the sound of it still carrying a warmth that made something in his chest tighten pleasantly. "Good night, Elira," he replied, and watched her walk away with an expression on his face that Garrick, had he been present to witness it, would have found entirely unfamiliar on the features of the man he had known since childhood, an expression that looked, unmistakably, like the beginning of something neither fear nor pride could fully hold back any longer. Not everyone within the palace welcomed the change that had come over their king. Among the council members who had grown comfortable under Ronan's old, unyielding manner of rule, none watched the shift with more suspicion than Lord Bramwell, a distant cousin of the royal family, who had long harbored ambitions of greater influence within the court. Bramwell had built his position carefully over the years, cultivating alliances among the older nobility, and he viewed the sudden softening in Ronan's temperament, the public restoration of a dismissed servant, the rumored apology to a lowly guard, as dangerous cracks in the foundation of royal authority, cracks he intended to exploit before they could close again. It was Bramwell who first raised the subject of Ronan's mate before the full council, choosing his moment carefully during a session ostensibly called to discuss trade agreements with the southern territories. "There are rumors, my king," he said, his tone carefully respectful, even as his words carried a clear edge, "that you have found your fated mate among the palace staff. A healer's assistant, I am told, of no particular family or standing." The council chamber went quiet, every eye turning toward Ronan, who sat at the head of the long table with an expression that gave away nothing of his thoughts. He had known, of course, that word of the bond would eventually spread beyond the small circle who already knew, but he had not expected the subject to be raised so directly, so publicly, in a setting designed to test his authority in front of the very people whose support he needed to maintain stability throughout the kingdom. "The rumors are accurate," Ronan said finally, his voice level and controlled. "I have found my mate. Her name is Alira Hart, and she serves as assistant to the royal healer." Murmurs rippled around the table, and Bramwell's expression sharpened with the satisfaction of a man who had achieved exactly the reaction he sought. "With respect, my king, a mate of such humble origin brings no strategic advantage to the crown. Previous kings have often set aside the demands of fate in favor of alliances that strengthen the kingdom's position. Surely you understand the importance of such considerations, particularly now, with rebel forces still active along our borders and neighboring territories watching closely for any sign of weakness." The suggestion hung in the air, unmistakable in its implication, and Ronan felt something cold settle in his chest, an old, familiar instinct rising to meet the challenge. The instinct that had once driven him to dismiss Della without a single question, to accuse Corwin without seeking the truth. But beneath that old instinct, something new had taken root in recent weeks, something steadier and more considered, and he found himself pausing before responding, weighing his words with a care he would not have exercised only a month earlier. "Lord Bramwell," Ronan said finally, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "I understand the political considerations you raise. I have weighed them carefully myself, more carefully than you might imagine. But a bond such as this is not something offered lightly by fate, and I have come to believe, through hard experience these past weeks, that strength built on isolation is no strength at all. Alira Hart has shown me more honesty and more genuine care for the well-being of this kingdom's people than any advisor at this table, present company included. I do not intend to set aside such a bond simply because her birth was humble." Bramwell's expression tightened, though he inclined his head in a show of deference that did not reach his eyes. "As you say, my king, I meant no offense, only to raise considerations I believed relevant to the stability of your rule." The meeting continued, moving on to other matters, but Ronan could feel the weight of Bramwell's disapproval lingering in the room, and he understood, with the clear-eyed certainty of a man who had learned to see patterns he might once have missed, that this would not be the last challenge he faced regarding his choice of mate. Word of the confrontation spread through the palace before the day was finished, reaching Alira through Margaret, who delivered the news with obvious concern. "You should be careful," Margaret said, her weathered face creased with worry, as she and Alira worked together, preparing the evening's medicines. "Bramwell is not a man who accepts defeat easily. He has spent years building his influence, and he will not welcome a mate who threatens the kind of court he has grown comfortable navigating." "What can he actually do?" Alira asked, though a familiar knot of anxiety had already begun tightening in her stomach. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but men like Bramwell rarely give up simply because they've been told no once." Margaret's warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, a formal accusation was brought before the council, claiming that Alira had used her position within the infirmary to improperly influence the king's judgment, providing him with herbs that altered his temperament and clouded his ability to rule with proper strength and clarity. The accusation was absurd on its face, easily disproven by anyone who understood even the basics of healing herbs, but it was designed not to succeed on its merits, but to sow doubt, to force a public confrontation that would test both Ronan's resolve and the loyalty of a court still uncertain about the changes they had witnessed in their king. Ronan called an emergency session of the full council the following morning, and this time, Alira herself was summoned to stand before the assembled nobility, her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling, though she refused to let her fear show on her face. She had faced down the Alpha King himself in a training yard weeks earlier, she reminded herself. She would not crumble before a room full of nobles now, whatever accusations Bramwell chose to level against her. "The accusation before this council," Ronan said, rising from his seat at the head of the table, his voice carrying the full authority of his position, "claims that Alira Hart has manipulated my judgment through improper use of medicinal herbs. I have reviewed the infirmary's records myself, alongside Margaret, the royal healer, who has served this palace faithfully for over 30 years. There is no evidence whatsoever to support this claim. He turned to look directly at Bramwell, who sat rigid at the far end of the table, his expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. I understand that change is uncomfortable, particularly for those who have grown accustomed to a certain manner of rule. I understand that some among you preferred a king who ruled through fear rather than through honest judgment, who never questioned his own decisions, who never admitted when he was wrong. But I will tell you plainly, before this entire council, that the king I was before I met Alira Hart was not a better ruler. He was simply a more comfortable one for those who benefited from never being challenged. The chamber fell silent, every eye fixed on Ronan as he continued, his voice growing steadier with each word, the old fear of vulnerability that had once governed every aspect of his rule giving way, finally and completely, to something far more solid. I have made mistakes as your king, he continued. I dismissed a loyal servant without asking a single question about her innocence. I publicly humiliated a young guard who had done nothing wrong, blaming him for a failure that belonged to the chaos of battle rather than to any fault of his own. These were not moments of strength. They were failures of judgment born from a belief, taught to me since childhood, that admitting fault was a weakness no king could afford. I have since learned otherwise, and I owe that lesson, in large part, to the honesty of the woman standing before you now, a woman this council has chosen to accuse rather than thank. He turned to Alira, and something in his expression softened, the formal authority of the king giving way, just for a moment, to something more personal, more openly affectionate than he had ever allowed himself to show in public before. Alira Hart is my fated mate, and I stand by that bond fully, without reservation, whatever considerations of birth or strategic advantage some among you might prefer I weigh instead. If this council cannot accept that decision, I will hear your objections directly, rather than through accusations designed to discredit an innocent woman who has done nothing but make this kingdom, and its king, better than we were before. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, and for a moment, Alira was uncertain whether the council would accept this direct challenge or whether Bramwell's faction would push back further. But slowly, one by one, the nobles around the table began to nod, some reluctantly, others with genuine respect visible in their expressions, until even Bramwell, recognizing the shift in the room's mood, offered a stiff, grudging inclination of his head. "The accusation is withdrawn, my king," Bramwell said finally, his voice tight with poorly concealed frustration. "I trust the matter is settled." "It is settled," Ronan said firmly, and the council session ended shortly after, the nobles filing out with expressions ranging from admiration to wary reconsideration, but with no further challenge raised against the bond their king had so publicly and firmly defended. Alira waited until the chamber had emptied before crossing to where Ronan still stood, her heart still racing from the tension of the confrontation, though beneath the lingering fear, something warmer had taken root, a gratitude and affection she no longer felt any need to guard against. "Thank you," she said softly, once they were alone. "There is nothing to thank me for," Ronan said, taking her hands in his own, the gesture simple, but carrying a weight of sincerity that made her breath catch. "You have given me more honesty in these past weeks than I received in my entire life before I met you. Defending that gift before a room full of nobles was the least I owed you." Alira felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, and this time she did not try to hide them, allowing herself, finally and completely, to trust the bond fate had placed between them, the same bond she had once feared as much as Ronan had, now standing revealed as something far more valuable than either of them had initially believed possible. The formal bonding ceremony took place a month later, once the last of the rebel forces had been fully dispersed, and the palace had settled back into a steadier rhythm. It was a smaller gathering than tradition typically demanded for a king's mate, held in the same garden where Ronan and Alira had shared so many of their quiet, honest conversations in the weeks leading up to this day, though what it lacked in grandeur it more than made up for in genuine warmth, a quality that had been notably absent from most formal occasions within the palace during the years of Ronan's father's rule. Della stood near the front of the small gathering, having long since returned to her position as head of the household staff, her eyes bright with tears as she watched the ceremony unfold. Corwin stood among the guards, fully restored not only to his rank, but to a position of genuine respect among his fellow soldiers, having earned a reputation for steady courage during the Northern Campaign that no single moment of public humiliation had managed to erase in the end. Garrick stood near the king's side, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who had watched his closest friend grow into someone he barely recognized, in the best possible way, over the course of a few short months. Margaret, seated near the front with the other honored guests, watched Alira with the fierce, quiet pride of a woman who had raised a daughter in every way that mattered, and Alira, catching the old healer's eye during a pause in the ceremony, felt a swell of gratitude so complete it nearly overwhelmed her. Gratitude for the woman who had saved her from grief all those years ago, gratitude for the strange, unexpected path that had led her to this garden, to this moment, to the man now standing before her with an expression of open, undisguised affection that would have been unimaginable to anyone who had known him only a few months earlier. Even Bramwell attended, standing at a respectful distance near the back of the gathering, his expression carefully neutral, though there was something almost like grudging respect in the way he watched the proceedings, a recognition, perhaps, that the king before him had proven himself stronger, not weaker, for the changes he had undergone. The ceremony itself was simple, following the old traditions passed down through generations, a formal acknowledgement of the mating bond fate had placed between them, sealed with words neither of them had needed to rehearse, spoken freely and easily in front of the gathered witnesses. When it came time for Ronan to speak his vows, his voice carried none of the stiffness that had once characterized every formal address he gave, none of the careful distance he had once maintained, even in his most personal moments. "I did not choose this bond," he said, looking directly at Alira. "But I have come to understand that some of the best things in life are not chosen, they are simply given, and the only real choice we have is whether to accept them with open hands or push them away out of fear. I spent most of my life believing that strength meant needing nothing from anyone, that vulnerability was a weakness a king could not afford. You taught me otherwise, not through lectures or arguments, but simply through your own honesty, your own refusal to flatter me when I did not deserve flattery, your own willingness to see the man beneath the crown, and to believe, even when I did not believe it myself, that he was capable of becoming something better." Alira, her own eyes bright with tears she did not try to hide, spoke her own vows in return, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I did not expect to find my fated mate in the most feared ruler in the region," she said, drawing a soft ripple of amused laughter from the gathered guests, "and I certainly did not expect that the man behind that reputation would turn out to be someone brave enough to practice apologies alone in a dusty storage room, determined to get the words right even when they did not come easily. That kind of courage, the courage to admit fault and try again, matters more to me than any crown or any title. I accept this bond gladly, Ronan Blackthorne, not because fate demanded it, but because I have come to know the man beneath it, and I find that I love him." The word love, spoken plainly and without hesitation, seemed to settle something final and complete between them, and when Ronan leaned forward to seal the bonding with a gentle kiss, the assembled guests erupted into genuine, warm applause, a stark contrast to the careful, formal silence that had marked every previous ceremony held within these palace walls during the old king's reign. Afterward, as the small celebration continued into the evening with food and music spread across the garden, Alira found a quiet moment alone with Ronan near the edge of the gathering, away from the noise and warmth of the celebration, though neither of them minded the brief solitude. "I have a request," Alira said, a teasing note creeping into her voice as she looked up at him. "Anything," Ronan said, and he meant it, the word coming easily now in a way it never would have before he met her. "If you ever wrong me," Alira said, fighting to keep a straight face, "I expect the full treatment, pacing, muttering, at least 4 attempts before you get it right. I've grown rather fond of watching you work through the words, and I would hate to be cheated out of the performance, simply because you've had more practice now." Ronan laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that still felt new and precious to hear from him, and he pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. I will do my best to earn that performance as rarely as possible, he said. But should the need arise, I promise you the full display, pacing and muttering included. Good, Illyra said softly, smiling against him. Because for a man who once believed 2 simple words were beneath a king's dignity, you've become remarkably good at using them. I had an excellent teacher, Ronan replied, and drew her into a gentle embrace beneath the darkening evening sky, the sound of music and laughter drifting from the garden behind them, the palace that had once been ruled by fear now settling, slowly and steadily, into something warmer, something built not on the old foundation of unyielding strength, but on the harder, more lasting strength of honesty, humility, and the simple, transformative courage it took to say, "The kingdom that had once feared its Alpha King above all else came, in the years that followed, to respect him for an entirely different reason, not for the harshness of his judgment, but for the fairness of it, not for his refusal to bend, but for his willingness to bend when bending was right." A lesson he carried forward in every decision he made from that day onward, and a lesson he never forgot he had first learned from the woman who had caught him, quite by accident, practicing how to say the 2 words that changed everything.